For years, Officer Maddox harassed and humiliated those he deemed beneath him, confident that his badge would shield him from consequences. One morning, he stopped a black woman walking through her neighborhood, claiming she looked suspicious. She didn't back down. Words became threats, and threats became force. Maddox drew his gun, and in the chaos, it fired. He then arrested her on the spot, convinced she'd paid dearly for standing up to him. He thought the encounter was over, that the consequences would only be hers, but Maddox had no idea who he was dealing with. That woman wasn't just any pedestrian. She was Celeste James, the FBI director. He thought she'd be silent. He thought his badge would protect him. He thought the system would bury the truth, just as it always had. This time, the system wouldn't save him, because Celeste James wasn't walking away. She was fighting back. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The city still felt half asleep, its streets quieter than usual under the soft light of a new day. Birds rustled faintly in the trees lining the sidewalks, and the occasional jogger passed by with a nod or glance. Celeste James moved at a steady pace, earbuds tucked into her jacket pocket, as she absorbed the peaceful morning sounds around her. She enjoyed these early walks, moments that allowed her to simply be herself. No meetings, no titles, no weighty decision, just another person out for a stroll. Her path curved through a quiet neighborhood of brick row houses, their windows catching glints of the rising sun. A couple sat on their porch, sipping coffee from matching mugs. Celeste waved back as they smiled her way, her steps calm and measured. She crossed at the corner, her gaze sweeping down the block to check the traffic light, even though no cars approached. That was when she saw the patrol car. It was angled toward the curb a little awkwardly, engine running. The officer inside wasn't typing on a laptop or scanning a clipboard. He was watching her. Celeste noted him but didn't change her stride. She had seen that look before. Not casual observation, but assessment, judgment, measuring her presence against some invisible standard. A shift in her shoulders was the only sign she had registered it. But she kept walking, as though nothing had changed. As she continued down the block, she heard the low hum of the engine. The car moved, not fast, but just enough to match her pace. She felt the deliberate crawl behind her before she glanced back and saw the cruiser now following at a slow roll. Her jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, but she didn't stop. This was not new, and she knew better than to let him see any sign of unease. The cruiser eased up beside her and stopped again. This time the door creaked open, and the officer stepped out onto the sidewalk. "Ma'am?" The word was polite, but it carried a note of command. Celeste turned, her expression calm but inquisitive. "Yes?" The officer was tall and solidly built, with a close-cropped haircut that matched his pressed uniform. His tone was measured, but his body language conveyed authority, not inquiry. "Morning," he began, his eyes scanning her. "Just wanted to ask, do you live in the area?" The question was casual, but Celeste knew it wasn't innocent. "Yes, officer, I live nearby," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" He nodded slightly, as though considering her answer. "Not a problem, ma'am. Just doing my rounds. We've had some reports of unusual activity around here recently, so I'm keeping an eye out." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Unusual activity?" she asked. "I'm just out for a walk." "Sure, I get that," he said, shifting his weight. "But you see, we've had some people loitering, and a few cars broken into. Just making sure everyone's where they're supposed to be." Her lips pressed into a thin line for a moment. Then she spoke evenly. "I haven't seen anything like that. It's a quiet neighborhood." He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth behind it. "Yeah, that's what they always say. You sure you haven't noticed anything out of place?" Celeste kept her tone calm but firm. "I'm certain." The officer's gaze lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary. Then he tilted his head. "Mind telling me exactly which house you live in?" Her patience thinned, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I've answered your questions. I don't believe I need to provide you with that information." Something shifted in his stance. It was subtle, but the air seemed to tighten. His smile disappeared, replaced by a faint scowl. "Well, I'm just trying to keep the area safe, ma'am, he said, his tone sharpening slightly. If you don't want to cooperate, that's up to you. But it's going to look a lot better for you if you work with me here. Celeste tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without blinking. I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm just asking why you need this information. His posture stiffened, and his hand rested casually on his hip, not on his gun, but close enough to make a point. The tension grew thicker as he squinted at her, as though trying to decide what game she was playing. I'd hate to have to take this any further, he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. You seem like a reasonable person. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She exhaled slowly, keeping her stance relaxed. Officer, she said, her voice firm but calm, I've done nothing wrong. If there's something you suspect me of, I'd like to know what it is. Otherwise, I'd prefer to finish my walk. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his fingers tapped once on his belt. The air felt heavy, the kind of moment where small decisions could shift the course of events. Celeste held her ground, her eyes steady on his. Maddox's voice dropped lower. You think you can just walk away from me? Her silence spoke louder than words, and that silence, strong, unflinching, was the moment when things began to spiral. Maddox shifted his weight, his stance widening as if to make himself seem larger. The subtle calm she carried, arms relaxed, posture steady, only appeared to deepen the furrow in his brow. His fingers hovered near his hip, not quite touching his belt, but close enough to send a message. Ma'am, he said again, his tone sharpening, I'm asking you for some ID. Let's keep this simple, all right? Celeste's expression remained neutral. Officer, I'm out for a walk. Is there a reason you need my ID? Maddox exhaled, his lips tightening. You're in an area where we've had complaints, break-ins, trespassing. And I see someone walking around without a care in the world. That's why I need to confirm who I'm talking to. Celeste tilted her head slightly. Is there a description of a suspect I match? Or any specific report that would involve me? He frowned. I'm just asking a question. If you've got nothing to hide, then this should be easy. Just a quick check, and you're on your way. I'm not refusing to answer, officer, she said carefully. But I'm asking you to clarify. What about me seems suspicious? His shoulders stiffened. How about the fact that you keep dodging a simple request? When someone won't answer straight, it raises questions. And right now, I'm the one asking the questions. Her eyes stayed on him, calm and steady. I'm walking on a public street. That's not a crime. If you suspect me of something, I'd like to know what it is. Maddox's jaw tightened. This isn't a courtroom, lady. You don't get to cross-examine me. I've got every right to ask you who you are and what you're doing here. I've been patient, but if you're gonna act like this, I'll have to assume you don't belong here. That's an assumption, not a fact, she said quietly. And I'd prefer facts, officer. The word facts seemed to hit a nerve. His face darkened, his voice lowering. All right, fine. You want facts? I see someone wandering around a residential neighborhood, not from around here, refusing to cooperate. Fact. That's suspicious. Fact, Celeste countered, her tone even. I'm walking, not loitering, and I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking for clarification on why you're stopping me. Maddox stepped closer, his boots scraping the pavement. You think you're smart, don't you? Trying to talk circles around me. But you're not above the law. I never said I was, she replied. I'm just asking you to follow the same rules you enforce. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands resting on his hips. The tension between them had grown thick, the quiet neighborhood fading into the background. He glared at her for a long moment before muttering, People like you always think you're so clever. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Maddox leaned forward, his voice dropping. You can make this easy, or you can make it difficult. Up to you. I'd prefer clear communication, Celeste replied. Not threats. Maddox's face flushed, his patience clearly wearing thin. His hand shifted toward his belt, the movement calculated and deliberate. I'm giving you one last chance. Don't make me take this further. Maddox's lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. His hand rested just shy of his holster now, his stance wide and confrontational. "You think this is a debate?" he asked, his voice colder. "You're stalling, refusing to comply." "That's resisting, ma'am. You know what that means, right?" Celeste's shoulders squared slightly, her tone still calm. "I'm standing still. I haven't gone anywhere." "That's not resisting." Maddox let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Standing still? You've been dodging every question I've asked. Every time I give you an order, you talk around it. That's resisting. You don't think it is? Too bad. I decide what resisting looks like." She kept her voice level. "Resisting means physically opposing you. I haven't done that." He leaned in slightly, his sneer deepening. "Lady, the way you're acting, it's the same thing. Non-compliance is resistance, and resistance is a problem." He moved closer, his hand twitching near his holster. The pressure in the air thickened, his aggression mounting with every breath. He was no longer just trying to assert control. He was looking for a reason to take this further. "I told you to keep your hands in sight. I told you to answer my questions. And all I've gotten is excuses. If you're not resisting, then show me you can follow instructions." "I haven't done anything wrong," Celeste said again firmly. "You still haven't given me a clear reason why you stopped me." His expression twisted into something darker. "You keep talking in circles like you're some kind of lawyer. You think you're smarter than me? You think you're gonna talk your way out of this?" "That's not what I'm doing," she replied. "I'm asking you to tell me what crime you think I committed." Maddox's hand shot out, grabbing her shoulder with enough force that she felt his fingers pressing into her muscles. The sudden contact made her body tense, but her voice remained steady. "Let go of my shoulder." His grip only tightened. "You don't give the orders here." Her voice lowered. "Remove your hand." The calm, unyielding tone in her words sent a flash of frustration across Maddox's face. He had expected fear, compliance, something he could interpret as submission. Instead, her stillness and poise only seemed to provoke him further. "Or what?" Maddox growled. "What are you gonna do about it?" She took a slow breath. "You need to step back." But he didn't step back. His free hand moved, drawing his weapon in one smooth, deliberate motion. The gun was low, not yet pointed directly at her, but its presence was enough to shift the confrontation into a far more dangerous territory. "Hands up!" he barked, his voice hard and commanding. Celeste's eyes flicked briefly to the weapon, then back to him. Her posture didn't change, though her muscles tensed slightly. "You're escalating something that doesn't need to be escalated." "I said, hands up," Maddox repeated, his tone rising. She lifted her hands slowly, palms open, showing she was unarmed. "There's no need for that. I'm cooperating." "Now you want to cooperate," he snarled. "Too late for that. I'm done playing your games." His gun hand wavered slightly as he shifted closer. The tension in his shoulders, the redness creeping up his neck, it all signaled a man teetering on the edge of control. Celeste watched him carefully, every movement calculated, every word chosen deliberately. "Lower the weapon," she said, her voice firm but calm. "No one needs to get hurt. I'll decide what needs to happen," Maddox snapped. "And you? Get on the ground." Her eyes stayed on his, unblinking. "Why would I need to get on the ground? I'm not a threat. I'm not running. I'm not armed." "You're not following orders," he shouted. "That's the problem. You think you're so smart. You think you can just stand there and talk your way out of this. But guess what? You're under arrest." Her voice remained even. "Arrest for what? For walking down the street? For resisting," he said, almost spitting the words. "For not following my commands." "I've done nothing illegal," she replied. "Get down!" he shouted again, stepping closer, the gun trembling slightly in his hand. "I'm not resisting," she said. "But I'm not going to get down on the ground without reason." That was it. Maddox lunged forward, his hand moving to grab her arm. She pivoted instinctively, stepping back just enough to create space. She didn't strike him. Her movements were defensive, designed to deflect and maintain balance. "Stop resisting!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the buildings. "You're escalating this, not me," Celeste said. "Shut up!" Maddox roared, his face flushing red as he swung his gun hand toward her again. She stepped inside his guard, redirecting his arm while keeping her own motions controlled. The gun discharged with a sharp crack, and they both froze for half a second. A stinging sensation spread along her upper arm. She glanced down, seeing the torn fabric and the faint line of blood. The bullet had grazed her. She sucked in a steadying breath, her mind still focused. The sound of the shot seemed to jolt Maddox out of his rage. He saw the blood, his eyes widening for a moment before narrowing. He used the opening, grabbing her wrist and twisting her arm behind her back. "You're done," he muttered, his tone triumphant. He pressed her against a nearby parked car, forcing the cuffs onto her wrists. Celeste didn't resist. Her gaze remained steady as he tightened the cuffs, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest. You think you're walking away from this?" he growled. As he pushed her toward the patrol car, she didn't reply. The pain in her arm was sharp, but her silence was sharper. Maddox thought he had control now, that this was over. But the wheels in her mind were already turning. She let him think he had won. After all, Maddox still had no idea who he was dealing with. The ride to the precinct was steeped in tense silence, broken only by the rumble of the cruiser's engine. Maddox, seated rigidly at the wheel, refused to look back at Celeste in the rearview mirror. His knuckles were pale against the steering wheel, his jaw set. The sound of his heavy breathing filled the confined space, a low, uneven rhythm that betrayed the adrenaline still coursing through him. Celeste sat calmly in the back seat, her cuffed hands resting lightly on her lap. Her upper arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed her. The tear in her sleeve, a subtle reminder of how quickly things had escalated. Despite the sting, she remained composed, her posture steady. Her eyes were fixed forward, observing the road ahead but giving no indication of discomfort or unease. Maddox muttered under his breath occasionally, almost as if he couldn't help it. "Thinks she can just talk her way out. Can't believe the nerve. People like her always think." The words were fragmented, trailing off into a frustrated sigh. The city's early morning calm began to break as they neared the precinct. The streets grew busier, the sidewalks more populated. The cruiser's reflection passed over rows of shop windows and office facades. Celeste remained silent, her thoughts methodical. She had made the decision not to reveal who she was, not yet. It wasn't a question of ego. It was about letting the process run its course, about exposing Maddox's actions in full light, with no room for him to claim ignorance or confusion. The truth would speak for itself, and Maddox wouldn't see it coming. As the cruiser turned into the precinct lot, Maddox finally glanced at her in the mirror. His eyes were cold and hard, searching for some hint of remorse or fear, something he could latch onto. When he saw none, his lips pressed into a tight line. They pulled into a space near the entrance. Maddox slammed the gear into park, stepped out, and yanked open the rear door. "Out," he said tersely. Celeste moved deliberately, stepping out of the car with her usual composure. Maddox gripped her arm roughly, his way of asserting control, but she didn't react. Her calm seemed to irritate him more than any resistance would have. She could feel the tension radiating off him as he led her toward the station. Inside, the station buzzed with its usual morning energy. Officers were at their desks, typing up reports, chatting over coffee, and fielding calls. Maddox strode in, his grip firm on her arm, and the low murmur of activity began to falter. People looked up, some pausing mid-conversation. It wasn't often that Maddox brought in someone personally, and it was even less common to see him visibly agitated. Captain Ruiz, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s, emerged from her office at the sound of Maddox's heavy boots. She caught sight of him dragging Celeste through the precinct and frowned. "Maddox!" she called, her voice cutting through the air. "What's going on here?" "Got a suspect who resisted arrest," Maddox replied curtly, barely sparing her a glance as he headed for the processing desk. Ruiz's eyes narrowed as she watched him. Something about his tone, his posture, made her pause. She looked at Celeste, taking in the blood-stained sleeve and the way she carried herself. calm, poised, far from the disorderly picture Maddox was trying to paint. Ruiz stepped in front of Maddox, her hand up to stop him. "Hold on. Let me see her ID." Maddox stiffened. "I haven't processed her yet." "Then do it now," Ruiz said, her voice firm. "If she resisted, you should have her information. Let's make it official." Maddox hesitated, his jaw working. He pulled out his radio. "Run the name Celeste James," he said, glaring at the officer behind the desk. "Check her in the system." The officer, a young man named Harris, nodded and started typing. The moment stretched, the clatter of keys punctuating the silence. Maddox stood with his arms crossed, the tension in his body evident. Ruiz watched him closely, her arms folded, waiting. Harris's eyes widened slightly as he stared at the screen. He looked up at Maddox, then at Ruiz. "Captain, we have a situation." Ruiz stepped closer. "What is it?" Harris cleared his throat, his voice lowering. She's listed as the director of the FBI." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Ruiz turned sharply toward Maddox, her expression sharp. "What? That can't be right," Maddox said, his voice rising. She can't. That's—" His words stumbled over each other as his face turned pale. The confidence, the aggression, the arrogance, all of it drained away in an instant. Ruiz, now glaring at him, stepped forward. "What the hell happened out there, Maddox? What did you do?" I didn't know," Maddox stammered. She didn't tell me who she was." Ruiz raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't think to ask before it got to this point? You shot her. You arrested her. And you didn't even check her ID." She was resisting," Maddox insisted weakly. "She wouldn't cooperate." "She's the director of the FBI," Ruiz said, her tone cold and sharp. "The highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country. And you decided to manhandle her, shoot at her, and arrest her without knowing who you were dealing with?" Maddox's mouth opened, but no words came out. His shoulders slumped as he realized the gravity of what he'd done. Ruiz turned to Celeste, her voice losing some of its edge. "Director James, are you all right?" Celeste gave her a small, composed nod. "I'm fine, Captain, but we need to address what happened here." Ruiz nodded slowly, her mind already racing through the implications. She turned back to Maddox, her expression dark and unreadable. "We'll be reviewing everything. Your body cam footage, the dash cam, your report. Every single detail." Maddox opened his mouth, but Ruiz raised a hand to silence him. "Don't say another word. Not until Internal Affairs is finished." He stood frozen, his earlier bravado long gone. The weight of the moment had drained the color from his face. Around the room, officers exchanged glances, the tension palpable. "I'll get a medic for that arm," Ruiz said to Celeste. "And then I'll be calling Internal Affairs." Celeste nodded once, her expression calm. "Thank you, Captain." She knew the process had just begun. Maddox's actions wouldn't simply disappear into the precinct's filing cabinet. There would be investigations, inquiries, consequences. She intended to see that they happened, not as the director of the FBI throwing her weight around, but as a citizen demanding accountability. And as she watched Maddox disappear into the back of the station, she couldn't help but think, justice wasn't just a word. It was a process. And today, it was one step closer. In the brightly lit processing room, the tension was almost tangible. The officers who had been busy at their desks now stood frozen, their attention fixed on the screen where Harris had typed in Celeste's information. The air felt thick with disbelief. "She's the director of the FBI," Harris repeated, his voice trembling slightly. Captain Ruiz, already stepping forward, stopped short, as if the words hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Her sharp gaze shot to Maddox, then back to the screen. The color drained from her face. "Are you sure?" she demanded, her voice low and controlled. Harris nodded. "I double-checked it. It's her." The murmurs that had started quietly around the precinct fell away, leaving a heavy silence. Eyes darted between Maddox and Celeste, then back to the captain. A few officers stepped back, their expressions shifting from casual curiosity to something closer to alarm. Maddox, standing stiffly by the processing desk, still hadn't fully processed what Harris had said. His expression was a mask of stubborn confidence. He leaned in, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Director of the FBI? That's a good one," he scoffed. "She doesn't look like any director I've ever seen." Ruiz turned sharply toward him, her hand slicing through the air. "Maddox, shut up." The sudden command left him momentarily stunned. The smugness faded from his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. His eyes darted to the screen, then back to Ruiz. "You don't believe this, do you? She was resisting. She wouldn't give me ID. I had to." "Had to what?" Ruiz snapped, her voice rising. "Shoot her? Drag her in here like a common criminal? You just arrested the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country, and you didn't even know who she was." Maddox's lips parted, but no words came out. His confidence wavered as he finally began to grasp the gravity of the situation. The other officers watched, their faces a mixture of shock and dread. No one spoke, but the weight of what was happening pressed down on everyone. Celeste, still standing calm and composed, despite her cuffed wrists and the faint streak of blood on her sleeve, looked at Ruiz with an air of quiet authority. "Captain Ruiz," she said evenly, "I'm glad you're here. I think we need to discuss what just happened." Ruiz nodded slowly, her eyes flicking once more to Maddox, who now seemed frozen in place. "You don't say," Celeste continued, her tone measured and deliberate. "Officer Maddox stopped me without cause. He failed to identify himself properly, then escalated the situation by using physical force and ultimately discharging his weapon. He arrested me under the pretense of resisting, when in fact, I never fled or fought back." Ruiz's gaze hardened as she listened. Her jaw clenched, and her hands balled into fists at her sides. When Celeste finished, Ruiz turned back to Maddox, her voice cold and cutting. "Is that true? Did you fire your weapon?" Maddox shifted his weight, his confidence crumbling. "It was an accident," he mumbled. "The gun went off during a scuffle. She was being difficult." Ruiz took a step closer, her presence towering over him. "Difficult? That's what you're going with? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't know who she was," Maddox blurted, his voice breaking. "How was I supposed to know she's the director of the FBI?" Ruiz said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It's your job to know who you're arresting before you haul them in here like some common criminal. You should have checked her ID the moment you stopped her." "She wouldn't give it to me," he protested weakly. Ruiz glared at him. "And you didn't think to call it in? To confirm her identity before escalating to force? Before firing a weapon? You didn't even think, did you?" Maddox's mouth opened, then closed. His gaze dropped to the floor. Ruiz exhaled heavily and turned back to Celeste. "Director James, I can't tell you how sorry I am. This should never have happened. We'll take every step to make it right." Celeste inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate that, Captain, but this isn't just about me. It's about the culture in this precinct. Officer Maddox isn't the first to act with such blatant disregard for proper procedure." Ruiz's face tightened, but she nodded. "You're right. This kind of behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum." At that, the murmur of voices rose slightly again, as if the rest of the precinct had been given permission to process what was unfolding. Maddox stood off to the side, pale and visibly shaken, his earlier bravado completely stripped away. The reality of what he'd done was sinking in, and it wasn't just his career that was at stake. Ruiz turned to Harris. "Get me all the paperwork on this, every detail of the stop, every note he filed. I want body cam footage, dash cam footage, anything we have." Harris nodded quickly. "Yes, Captain." Ruiz looked back at Maddox, her voice cold. "And you're done, effective immediately. You're suspended. Get out of my sight." Maddox hesitated, as if he might protest, but one look at Ruiz told him better. He turned, his steps sluggish, and disappeared toward the locker room. The other officers parted as he passed, none of them willing to meet his gaze. Ruiz took another deep breath and turned back to Celeste. "Director, we'll launch an immediate investigation. Internal affairs will be involved, and we'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." "Thank you, Captain," Celeste said, her voice calm. "I'll make sure this is followed through to the highest levels. It's not just about accountability. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else." Ruiz nodded solemnly. She glanced toward the rest of her officers, her face grave. "Let this be a wake-up call. This is not how we do things here. Not anymore." As the room remained still, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Celeste allowed herself a small, quiet sigh. The first steps toward accountability had been taken, but the road ahead was long. There would be reports, hearings, policy changes. Justice was never immediate, but it started here. By the end of the day, the story had already traveled far beyond the precinct walls. Word of the director's arrest spread rapidly, fueled by whispers among law enforcement circles and the steady drumbeat of media leaks. A brief mention on a local news station quickly became a top headline. The words "Director of the FBI" and "Arrested" didn't need much else to catch the attention of federal authorities. By morning, the Department of Justice had been informed, and Internal Affairs was preparing to descend on the precinct. Captain Ruiz knew she had no choice but to cooperate fully. The moment the news hit, her office phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from superiors, colleagues, and even old friends wanting to know how something like this could happen on her watch. The pressure was mounting, but she wasn't about to let the situation spiral further out of control. This was a mess of Maddox's making, and now it was her job to clean it up, or at least show she was willing to try. When the Internal Affairs team arrived, they brought the air of quiet authority that came with knowing they were there to assess, not to please. They worked methodically, reviewing the arrest report, watching the body cam footage, and interviewing everyone who had been in the station that morning. Ruiz sat down with them, her tone straightforward, and her answers measured. She didn't try to shield Maddox. She told them what she knew, that Maddox had made the arrest on his own, that he hadn't verified her identity, and that he had escalated a routine stop into something far more serious. As for Maddox himself, he was still clinging to what was left of his confidence. He had been officially suspended as soon as the full scope of his actions became clear, but he walked through the precinct hallways with his head high, his jaw set, as though daring anyone to challenge him. He spent most of his time muttering about how he hadn't done anything wrong, how he had simply followed procedure. His voice carried an edge of indignation, but it rang hollow in the ears of his colleagues, who had seen the footage and heard the fallout. In the meantime, Captain Ruiz took a more personal approach. She reached out to Director James directly, arranging a private meeting in her office. She didn't try to hide her unease as Celeste stepped into the room. The bandage on Celeste's arm stood out starkly against her otherwise composed appearance. A subtle yet powerful reminder of just how wrong things had gone. "Director," Ruiz began, gesturing toward a chair, "thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to speak with you directly, if that's all right." Celeste took a seat, her demeanor calm but unyielding. "Of course, Captain. I think a conversation is long overdue." Ruiz nodded, folding her hands on the desk. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what happened. I know that doesn't change what you went through, but I need you to understand that this isn't something I'm willing to let slide." Celeste gave a slight nod. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for action. This is about more than what happened to me. It's about what allowed this to happen in the first place." Ruiz leaned forward, her voice lowering. "I agree. I've seen issues in the precinct before, but this is a wake-up call. We need to change how we handle stops, how we train our officers, how we monitor their behavior. Maddox's actions didn't come out of nowhere. If I'm being honest, I should have seen this coming. Maddox didn't act alone," Celeste said pointedly. "Yes, he pulled the trigger, but the culture in this precinct allowed someone like him to thrive unchecked. You need to root that out. All of it." Ruiz's shoulders straightened. "I've already put him on indefinite suspension. Internal Affairs is going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. And believe me, if there are others who contributed to this culture, they'll be dealt with." Celeste's voice remained steady, but her words carried weight. Good, because I intend to follow through on this at the federal level. This won't disappear into some backroom report. This is going to be addressed, and everyone will know why it's being addressed. Ruiz met her gaze, the seriousness of the situation fully sinking in. Understood, Director. As they finished their conversation, Ruiz felt the shift, the realization that the precinct was no longer just a local operation. It was now under scrutiny at the highest levels, and that scrutiny wasn't going to fade anytime soon. Meanwhile, Maddox's bravado continued to crack. The murmurs in the station about his actions turned into outright stares. Officers who had once joked with him now avoided him, their glances filled with disapproval or disbelief. As he walked through the precinct's corridors one afternoon, he overheard two officers quietly discussing the bullet wound, how it symbolized not just his rashness, but the deeper failings of their department. They weren't just talking about his mistake. They were talking about what it meant, about what needed to change. Maddox clenched his fists as he walked past them, his face burning. He still believed he was right, that he had done his job, that she had been the one who pushed him into that corner. But the look on Captain Ruiz's face when she told him to leave the station still haunted him. The quiet authority in Celeste's voice as she calmly recounted every moment of the encounter still echoed in his ears. And now, the prospect of what was coming, a formal investigation, potential legal consequences, the loss of his career, was finally sinking in. As he sat alone in the locker room, his defiance began to falter. He wasn't just facing suspension. He wasn't just facing the end of his job. He was facing the reality of what he'd done, of who he'd chosen to pick a fight with. And as much as he wanted to hold on to his anger, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far greater than his badge. By the time the footage made it to the press, the story had already taken on a life of its own. A grainy, muted clip of Celeste's arrest appeared online one evening, first shared anonymously on a social media account, and then picked up by a local journalist. Within hours, it was all over the news. Major network primetime segments, cable roundtables, opinion columns, headlines and hashtags dominated the discussion. FBI director arrested by local police, racial profiling at the highest levels, and unequal justice exposed. The images told a damning story. Celeste's calm stance, her measured voice, her refusal to submit without cause, Maddox's aggressive posture, his escalating tone, and finally the loud, unmistakable crack of a gunshot, the bullet grazing her arm, the moment he yanked her roughly into cuffs. Civil rights organizations seized on the footage immediately. Advocacy groups and legal experts began dissecting the tape frame by frame, calling out every procedural failure, every unnecessary use of force. Prominent civil rights leaders took to social media and national platforms, describing the event as nothing less than a reckoning in uniform. Their speeches were pointed, their words cutting. If the director of the FBI can be treated this way, what does that say about our justice system? What does that say about the ordinary citizens who don't have the weight of a federal title behind them? The term stuck. Reckoning in uniform became a rallying cry, a hashtag, a shorthand for something that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. It was about Maddox, yes, but it was also about the broader system that allowed him to act with impunity. News outlets began running segments not just about the arrest, but about the precinct itself. Investigative reports surfaced, citing internal documents, anonymous sources, and the precinct's long history of misconduct complaints. And Maddox wasn't the only one under scrutiny. His record was unearthed and dissected. Excessive force complaints that had been quietly closed. Disciplinary actions that went nowhere. Testimony from citizens who had filed reports against him, only to see those reports vanish into departmental limbo. Every piece of information fed the growing outrage. The local police union attempted to push back at first, calling it a misunderstanding. But the footage told a different story, one that was impossible to spin. As the public outcry reached a fever pitch, Celeste was called to testify before a federal review board. The hearing was broadcast live, and millions tuned in. She sat at the long table, calm and composed. The bandage on her arm, a stark reminder of what had happened. Her words were measured, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the quiet fire behind them. "I was stopped without cause," she began, her voice steady. "I asked for clarification. I was not given any. When I refused to comply with a baseless order, the situation escalated. I was physically detained, and a firearm was discharged. The gunshot was a result of unnecessary force." The room was silent as she spoke, save for the clicking of keyboards as journalists live-tweeted every word. Celeste outlined the events calmly, but with enough detail to make the gravity of the situation clear. She described Maddox's tone, his body language, the moment he drew his weapon. She described the sound of the shot, the sting of the bullet grazing her arm, and the way she was forced into cuffs as if she were a common criminal. The footage was played again for the board, this time in a controlled, official setting. The room watched as Maddox's aggression unfolded in stark clarity. His words were loud, heated, his gestures sharp and forceful. Celeste's responses, by contrast, were calm, measured. She didn't move aggressively. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood her ground. The final moments of the footage, Maddox firing the gun and the rough handcuffing, drew audible gasps from some in the audience. On social media, commentators dissected every frame. One legal analyst wrote, "It's impossible to see this as anything other than a gross misuse of power. This isn't law enforcement. This is pure escalation." As the testimony concluded, Celeste left no doubt about what needed to happen next. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "This is about a culture that allows officers like him to act without accountability. That culture has to change, here and across the country." The national response was swift. Protests outside the precinct swelled. Citizens held signs with slogans like "Justice for Celeste," "Reckoning in Uniform," and "No one is above the law, not even the police." The precinct became a symbol of something larger than itself, and Maddox became the poster child for unchecked authority. For Maddox, the walls were closing in. His record, once quietly buried in departmental files, was now public knowledge. He watched as commentators on television and online tore into his history. Every use of force complaint, every citizen who had filed a report against him, every dubious traffic stop, all of it was out in the open. And every time he tried to explain himself, his voice carried a little less conviction. The excuses that might have worked in private fell flat under the scrutiny of millions. The local police department, the city government, and even state officials were now on notice. This was no longer just about Maddox. It was about the entire system that had let officers like him thrive. The term "reckoning in uniform" had gone viral, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Back at her office, high above the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., Celeste settled into her chair and began drafting the first of many policy proposals. The weight of recent events hung over her, but it only sharpened her focus. She had spent her career navigating power structures, identifying weaknesses, and building solutions. Now, she turned that experience toward reforming the very system that had failed so spectacularly. Her first step was a detailed memo to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. It outlined a proposal for federal oversight of the precinct, paired with a pilot program designed to combat the systemic flaws that had allowed someone like Maddox to thrive. Celeste's plan was comprehensive, targeting every stage of the policing process: mandatory bias training, community oversight panels, routine audits of officer conduct. Nothing was off the table. She called it the Accountability and Cultural Reform Pilot Program. This isn't just about holding one officer accountable. she explained during an initial meeting. It's about rebuilding trust at every level, from the precinct to the public. Not everyone in the room was convinced. One Justice Department official leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Director, these are ambitious changes. You're talking about federal oversight on a level we haven't seen before. How do you intend to get buy-in from the local authorities?" Celeste met his gaze without hesitation. "By showing results. We start with one precinct. Make it a model for transparency and accountability. If it works there, we'll have a template to expand nationwide. We can't wait any longer for incremental fixes. The public's trust is at stake." Her words carried the quiet authority of someone who had not only witnessed failure, but had lived through it, felt its impact firsthand. The officials exchanged glances, their murmurs fading into nods. The pilot program was approved to move forward, with Celeste's office leading the initiative. As the federal plan began to take shape, Celeste reached out to Captain Ruiz. She knew the cooperation of local leadership would be essential, and Ruiz had already shown a willingness to confront what had gone wrong under her watch. But now, Celeste needed more than cooperation. She needed commitment. The first meeting between them took place in the precinct's conference room. It was a stark setting, a rectangular table, chairs arranged in neat rows, a projector sitting idle in the corner. Ruiz stood by the window when Celeste entered, the faint lines around her mouth tightening as she turned to greet her. She gestured to a chair, her tone measured but cautious. "Director James, thanks for coming." Celeste offered a polite nod as she took a seat. "I appreciate you making the time, Captain. We have a lot to discuss." Ruiz remained standing for a moment longer, her arms crossed. "I want to be clear from the start. I'll cooperate with your initiative. I know what happened here can't happen again. But I'll admit I'm concerned. This precinct, well, it's not an easy place to make changes." "It doesn't have to be easy," Celeste replied. "It just has to happen." Ruiz exhaled, her arms falling to her sides as she finally sat down. "Fair enough. I've been reviewing the initial report on your pilot program. Federal oversight, community panels. It's going to stir things up. Some of my officers are already talking about transferring out. Others think it's all just political theater. They'll find out otherwise soon enough," Celeste said. "This isn't about politics. It's about ensuring that the people in this community have reason to trust the officers who patrol it. It's about making sure that no one else goes through what I went through. No one should have to wonder if a routine walk down the street will end with a gunshot and a pair of handcuffs." Ruiz flinched at the mention of the gunshot. Her eyes flicked to Celeste's arm, where the bandage still peeked out from beneath her sleeve. "I understand. I really do. And for what it's worth, I don't believe most of my officers would have handled that stop the way Maddox did." "But they let him keep working there," Celeste countered. "They saw his pattern of behavior, and no one stopped him. That's what we have to change." Ruiz nodded slowly. "You're right. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen." The room fell quiet for a moment. Outside, the precinct hummed with activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, conversations murmuring in the halls. But inside that conference room, the weight of what they were attempting settled over them both. "Maddox is just the start," Celeste said finally. "He's a symptom, not the disease. We need to address the culture that allowed someone like him to think he could act with impunity." Ruiz leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "And what happens if the changes don't stick? If the officers who've been here for years resist? If they start looking for ways to undermine it? Then we hold them accountable," Celeste said simply. "The ones who resist change can leave. The ones who stay will be part of something better." Ruiz held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." Meanwhile, the legal process against Maddox was moving swiftly. Internal Affairs had concluded their investigation, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The footage of the stop, the record of excessive force complaints, the reports from citizens, all of it painted a damning picture. The district attorney's office filed charges for aggravated assault and abuse of authority. Maddox, once so self-assured, now found himself sitting in a courtroom that was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and community leaders. His defense team attempted to argue that he had acted within the scope of his duties, but the video evidence was irrefutable. The footage showed his aggression, his unnecessary escalation, and the moment his gun discharged, grazing Celeste's arm. His history of complaints and disciplinary actions only reinforced the argument that he had repeatedly abused his position. As the trial unfolded, Maddox grew quieter. The defiance he had once displayed at the precinct was gone, replaced by a grim awareness of the consequences he now faced. When Celeste took the stand to testify, she did so with the same calm authority that had defined her throughout the ordeal. She spoke plainly, recounting every detail of the encounter, and left no doubt that Maddox's actions were not just reckless, but dangerous. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict was guilty on all charges. Maddox sat silently as the decision was read, his head bowed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and outside, a crowd that had been waiting for hours began chanting. The community had its answer. Justice, however delayed, was served. In the weeks that followed, the pilot program began to take root. Federal monitors visited the precinct regularly, observing shifts and reviewing records. Officers underwent the new training sessions, learning about de-escalation techniques, implicit bias, and community engagement. Community members joined oversight panels, providing input and holding the precinct accountable. Early reports showed signs of improvement. Complaints decreased, community trust began to inch upward, and even some skeptical officers admitted that the new approach felt more structured and fair. Captain Ruiz reported these changes to Celeste during their monthly meetings, and while the progress was slow, it was steady. Celeste knew that the road ahead was still long. Changing a single precinct wouldn't fix the broader issues overnight, but each small step, each officer who adapted, each community member who felt heard, each unjust action that was prevented, brought them closer to the vision she had fought for. Maddox's actions had sparked a national reckoning, and now that reckoning was turning into lasting reform. The ripple effect of Celeste's work began to show in unexpected places. Departments across the country, some under federal oversight, others watching from the sidelines, took note of the changes coming out of her pilot program. The headlines about her arrest and the resulting reforms had already sparked a national conversation, but now that conversation was shifting to action. It wasn't just about one precinct anymore. It was about a model that could be replicated, adapted, and improved upon. At first, the changes were small. A handful of departments quietly started pulling misconduct records from their archives, comparing complaints that had previously gone unresolved. In Memphis, a precinct commander implemented a new, simplified complaint filing system after attending one of Celeste's workshops. In Chicago, a training director invited her team to a panel discussion led by Celeste, where she explained the importance of recognizing patterns in officer behavior before they spiraled into misconduct. Each department that engaged with the new model began to realize that transparency and accountability weren't just buzzwords. They were tools that could prevent incidents from escalating into scandals. At the original precinct where it all began, the transformation was even more tangible. Ruiz, now fully on board with the reform efforts, introduced sweeping changes. Body cameras became standard issue for every officer on every shift. Mandatory sensitivity training sessions were scheduled twice a year, and they weren't just a check-the-box exercise. The sessions included interactive scenarios, community panel discussions, and lectures from civil rights historians. Officers were no longer able to brush them off as meaningless lectures. They were engaged, challenged, and sometimes uncomfortable. The new officer auditing program was perhaps the most controversial reform. Every officer's record, from complaints to commendations, was now reviewed quarterly by a panel that included not just department leadership, but also community members and independent auditors. Ruiz held a meeting shortly after the program was announced. She stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, and laid it out plainly. This is not a witch hunt. This is about improvement. If you're doing your job right, you've got nothing to worry about. If you're not, well, now's the time to change that. Not every officer took it well. Some grumbled. Others requested transfers. A few outright refused to participate, which led to disciplinary action. But the majority stayed, and slowly the culture began to shift. Officers who once viewed the community with suspicion began attending local events. They showed up at neighborhood association meetings, participated in youth mentorship programs, and walked their beats with a focus on building trust rather than enforcing authority. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But the effort was visible, and that mattered. For Celeste, the work didn't end at the precinct. She made a point of visiting local community centers regularly, not as the director of the FBI, but simply as Celeste James. She attended town hall meetings and church gatherings, listened to residents' concerns, and offered guidance on how to navigate the new complaint process or connect with precinct leadership. She avoided grand speeches or photo ops. Instead, she asked questions, shared her vision, and offered resources. At one such meeting in a neighborhood center, an elderly woman approached her after the discussion. "Director James," the woman began, her voice trembling slightly. "Just call me Celeste," she replied with a warm smile. "Celeste," the woman said, "I never thought I'd see someone in your position coming down here, talking to us, listening to us. It means more than you know." Celeste placed a hand on the woman's shoulder. "I'm here because of you. Because of this community, the work we're doing. None of it matters if it doesn't serve you. I'll keep coming back. I promise." In those spaces, Celeste's leadership took on a different form. It wasn't about the weight of her title or the authority she wielded. It was about using her position to amplify the voices that were too often ignored. Her approach wasn't flashy or loud. It was steady and consistent. She became a familiar face, someone people knew they could turn to. Trust that had been fractured was slowly mending. Back at the precinct, Ruiz held her officers accountable with the same straightforward approach she'd shown from the beginning. If someone made a mistake, they faced the consequences. But they were also given the tools to improve. Ruiz instituted a mentorship program, pairing younger officers with seasoned veterans who had embraced the new model. She met with her staff regularly, ensuring that no one could claim ignorance of the new policies or procedures. Celeste and Ruiz met once a month to review progress. They discussed the latest statistics: complaints down 30%, community engagement up 40%, and shared stories of how officers were adapting. Ruiz recounted one instance where an officer, once known for being overly aggressive, had diffused a tense situation simply by taking the time to talk to a distraught father instead of jumping to conclusions. "That's exactly the kind of change we need to see," Celeste said, her tone one of cautious optimism. "It's slow, but it's happening," Ruiz agreed. One officer at a time. As the months went on, the structural changes solidified. Community panels became a regular fixture, not just for reviewing complaints, but for advising on policy. The precinct held open house events, inviting residents to tour the facility, meet officers, and learn about the new oversight measures. Public trust, while still fragile, was beginning to grow. People felt safer filing complaints, knowing they would be taken seriously. They felt more connected to the officers who patrolled their streets, knowing those officers were being held to a higher standard. Celeste continued to push forward, never losing sight of the broader goal. The precinct's transformation was just one piece of the puzzle. She maintained open lines of communication with other departments that were testing similar reforms, sharing best practices, and offering guidance. Her work wasn't about creating a legacy. It was about creating a system that could sustain itself long after she was gone. And through it all, she remained true to her principles. She never used her title to gain personal power. She used it to protect those who had none. Her name became synonymous not with authority, but with accountability. She became a symbol of what policing could look like: fair, transparent, and just. In time, Celeste's efforts expanded beyond the precinct's borders. But in that small community, the change was felt most deeply. Residents who once felt invisible now had a seat at the table. Officers who once operated without oversight now worked under the watchful eyes of their peers and the public. And the neighborhood, once divided by mistrust, began to heal. Maddox sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his hand gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The news channels had stopped talking about him directly, but the damage to his name lingered like a shadow. The public vilification, the charges, the cold stares from his former colleagues, it all weighed on him. He had always thought of himself as a man who could weather any storm, but now he felt cornered, desperate, and enraged. It was in that moment of desperation that he made the call. The underground defense fund he contacted had long operated in the shadows, providing legal support and public relations aid to officers accused of misconduct. While they publicly denied encouraging any unlawful behavior, their network of attorneys, lobbyists, and sympathetic media outlets had a reputation for reframing cases, muddying narratives, and exploiting public confusion. Maddox had heard whispers about them over the years, but never thought he'd need their help. Now, he had no choice. The woman who answered on the other end had a measured, calm tone. "Officer Maddox," she said, her voice clipped. "We've reviewed your case. If you want our assistance, we need you to be prepared to push back. You'll need to tell your side loudly and clearly." Maddox hesitated. He knew what pushing back meant. It wasn't about the truth, it was about reshaping the story. But at this point, the truth didn't matter to him. He felt betrayed. By his department, by the system, and by the public who had so easily turned on him. If the fund was willing to back him, he'd play along. "What do you need me to do?" Maddox asked. "We'll draft statements," the woman said. "You'll make a public claim that this entire incident was orchestrated. You'll say that Director James deliberately provoked you, that she resisted arrest, and that she assaulted you. We'll position it as a calculated move on her part to create a scandal. With the right framing, we can shift public perception." "People have seen the footage," Maddox replied, his voice uncertain. "They'll know it's not true." "They've seen clips," she corrected. "Not the full context. Not your side. There are always gaps we can exploit. People want to believe that the system they trust didn't fail. We just have to give them an alternative narrative." Maddox's grip on the phone tightened. He felt a bitter satisfaction at the thought of turning the tables. If he could convince even a small segment of the public that Celeste had set him up, it might make him less of a pariah. And if he could plant doubts in the minds of those investigating him, maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way out of this mess. Over the following weeks, a coordinated campaign emerged. Social media accounts linked to fringe groups began circulating stories about a so-called conspiracy against Maddox. Anonymous blogs claimed that Celeste had a personal vendetta against the police, that she had orchestrated the confrontation to fuel her own agenda. Hashtags like Justice for Maddox and Exposing the Setup started to trend among certain circles. Some commenters even suggested that the footage had been edited, that what the public saw was a distorted version of events designed to frame an innocent officer. The noise was loud and persistent, even if it didn't gain mainstream traction. It created just enough doubt to complicate the investigation. Internal Affairs received a flood of inquiries from officers who had once worked alongside Maddox, some asking if they could clarify details about his record. Meanwhile, community members who had previously supported Celeste's reforms began receiving anonymous emails filled with twisted versions of the story. The goal wasn't to prove Maddox's innocence, it was to make the truth harder to find. Celeste, however, refused to engage directly. She read the headlines, the social media posts, the scathing comments, and remained outwardly unfazed. "We stick to the evidence," she told her team during a strategy meeting. "The moment we respond to those claims, we validate them. Let them shout. We'll let the facts speak for themselves. Instead of fighting the noise, Celeste doubled down on her efforts to uncover more evidence of systemic issues within the precinct. She worked closely with internal affairs, reviewing old case files, digging through archived complaints, and identifying patterns of misconduct that had been overlooked. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Maddox's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was the product of a culture that had allowed small violations to pile up until they were too big to ignore. Her findings were damning. One officer had been quietly disciplined for excessive force 5 times without a single complaint being made public. Another had falsified reports on multiple occasions, yet faced no meaningful consequences. Patterns emerged, showing how certain officers, often the same ones who were now supporting Maddox, had relied on unofficial channels to make complaints disappear or keep disciplinary actions light. The more Celeste dug, the more she realized that Maddox's loud counter-narrative was a desperate attempt to mask not just his own failings, but those of an entire broken system. When her team presented their findings to Internal Affairs and the Justice Department, the response was immediate. Federal investigators launched a broader probe into the precinct, expanding their scope to include not only Maddox's conduct, but the structural flaws that had allowed him to thrive. They brought in independent auditors and legal experts to review policies, evaluate training protocols, and recommend changes. While Maddox's claims gained traction among certain fringe groups, his allies in the precinct began to dwindle. The officers who had supported him grew quieter as the weight of the evidence piled up. The community, already skeptical of his character, rallied behind Celeste's reforms. The loudest voices backing Maddox became outliers, their arguments increasingly viewed as desperate attempts to distract from the growing tide of accountability. Celeste's refusal to engage directly with Maddox's narrative didn't mean she ignored it. She understood its power, how misinformation could spread faster than the truth, how even baseless claims could cloud judgment. But her strategy remained consistent. Gather facts, build the case, and let the evidence speak. And as the investigation widened, it became clear that no amount of shouting or finger-pointing would be enough to cover up the truth. What started as an investigation into a single precinct soon revealed a pattern that stretched far beyond local borders. As Celeste's team sifted through decades of files and correspondence, they found something both shocking and familiar. Precincts from various cities, quietly sharing strategies for avoiding scrutiny. These weren't casual exchanges. They were deliberate methods, tactics to minimize the visibility of complaints, obscure use of force records, and manipulate internal reviews. The evidence was fragmented at first. A few old emails between commanding officers hinting at best practices for rephrasing incident reports. A file tucked away in a rarely accessed database, detailing how one department had handled a high-profile excessive force case without it ever reaching the public. But as her team dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. Precincts from different states, some hundreds of miles apart, had been in contact for years, passing along methods to bury misconduct complaints and deflect federal inquiries. It was a web of corruption hidden in plain sight. Celeste's initial reaction was a mix of outrage and determination. She'd seen systemic issues before, patterns of misconduct allowed to fester because no one wanted to rock the boat. But this was different. This was coordinated. And the deeper they looked, the more she realized it wasn't limited to a few bad actors. It was a culture, entrenched and quietly maintained by a network of officers and administrators who believed they were above accountability. This isn't just a local problem, Celeste told her team during a late-night strategy session. Her voice was calm, but her words carried weight. What we've found so far shows a national pattern. These precincts aren't operating independently. They're learning from each other, sharing techniques, and deliberately avoiding oversight. If we don't address this at the federal level, it's only going to get worse. The Justice Department agreed. When Celeste presented her findings to the Attorney General, The response was swift. A national task force was formed, bringing together federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and forensic auditors. Their mission: to dismantle the network, expose its practices, and put safeguards in place to prevent it from ever rebuilding. Celeste was appointed as a key advisor, her role essential in guiding the task force through the tangled web of data and relationships. For weeks, the task force pored over thousands of documents, interviewed whistleblowers, and tracked down retired officers who had once participated in the network. Some cooperated willingly, providing details on how the system operated. Others stonewalled, claiming ignorance or blaming long-gone administrators. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. Celeste's office became the nerve center of the operation. Her desk, usually neat and organized, was now covered in charts and printouts, arrows connecting precincts, lists of names tied to buried complaints, dates and times of key exchanges. Maps of the United States were pinned to the walls, dotted with color-coded marks showing the extent of the network's reach. But even as the investigation grew, Celeste never lost sight of her original goal. This wasn't about settling scores or painting all officers with the same brush. It was about exposing the structures that allowed misconduct to flourish and creating a framework for lasting reform. She spent long hours drafting recommendations for policy changes. Each time the task force uncovered another layer of the network, Celeste and her team worked to develop solutions: mandatory public transparency for all internal investigations, whistleblower protections for officers who reported misconduct, federal oversight panels that could step in when local authorities failed to act. Yet for all the progress, the work was not without its challenges. The network's supporters, both those still on the force and those long retired, fought back in ways both subtle and overt. Anonymous emails arrived in Celeste's inbox, threatening her reputation. News outlets aligned with fringe groups ran editorials claiming the investigation was a federal overreach, a political hit job. Some of the precincts involved began destroying records or claiming that files had been lost in server outages. Every step forward seemed to prompt a new roadblock. Despite these hurdles, Celeste stayed focused. She leaned on her team, her allies in the Justice Department, and the communities who were now rallying behind the reforms. Community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even some current officers who had grown tired of the old system began speaking out in favor of the task force's work. Public support for reform grew, even as the network's defenders tried to sow doubt. The shift from one rogue officer to a national pattern of corruption was significant. It changed the tone of the entire conversation. What had begun as outrage over a single incident had evolved into a broader reckoning. The headlines now read, "National Task Force Targets Police Misconduct Network. Federal Probe Reveals Systemic Cover-Ups," and "A New Era of Accountability." As the task force built its case, the pressure mounted. Some precincts preemptively started their own internal audits, hoping to clean house before federal investigators arrived. Officers once loyal to the old ways quietly resigned or retired. Meanwhile, Celeste worked tirelessly to ensure the investigation wasn't just about uncovering wrongdoing, but about laying the foundation for a better system. One afternoon, as the task force reviewed its latest findings, an investigator turned to Celeste and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be able to fix this? I mean, after everything we've seen, how do you even begin to change a culture this entrenched?" Celeste paused, her gaze fixed on the map in front of her. "You start by exposing the truth," she said. "You hold people accountable, no matter how powerful they think they are. And then you rebuild. One policy at a time, one precinct at a time. You make it clear that this isn't how policing works in this country. Not anymore." Her words weren't just a statement of intent. They were a reflection of the fight she'd taken on. This wasn't about Maddox anymore. It wasn't even just about her arrest. It was about a system, a culture that had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. and Celeste was determined to bring it into the light. Maddox sat in the back corner of a dimly lit bar, the faint hum of a jukebox filling the silence between conversations. His drink sat untouched on the table in front of him. He wasn't there to unwind. He was waiting. The tension in his shoulders, the nervous glance he cast toward the door every few minutes, betrayed his unease. Finally, a man entered, his appearance nondescript, but his presence commanding. He wore a dark coat that hung just past his knees, and his gaze swept the room before settling on Maddox. The man walked over without hesitation and slid into the booth across from him. "You're late," Maddox said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man shrugged, his face calm. "This isn't the kind of meeting you rush. You're the one who reached out to me, remember? You knew how this works." Maddox leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need help. Real help. Everything's falling apart, and I can't go down like this." The man, a figure known only by his alias, Haven, studied Maddox for a moment before speaking. "And what exactly do you want me to do?" "You've got a reputation," Maddox replied. "You fix things, make problems disappear." Haven raised an eyebrow. "Fixing things isn't free, and it's never clean." Maddox's hands clenched into fists under the table. "I don't care about clean. I need certain people silenced, certain records lost." Haven leaned back, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're talking about federal witnesses, people who've already gone on record. They can be scared off," Maddox said quickly, "intimidated. And if they don't back down, we can make sure their statements vanish. You've done it before." Haven's smile disappeared. "I've done many things before. That doesn't mean I'll do them for you." Maddox's expression darkened. "I'm paying." "Of course you are," Haven said, his tone dismissive. "But understand this. If you bring me into this, you won't control what happens. Once I start, it doesn't stop until the problem is gone." "That's exactly what I need," Maddox said through gritted teeth. "Start with her." Haven tilted his head. "The director? Bold move. Her family. Anyone connected to her," Maddox said, his voice rising slightly. "She's the reason my life's been destroyed." Haven's gaze sharpened. "Careful now. This kind of play doesn't just put her at risk. You cross certain lines, and you might find yourself in a worse position than you are now." Maddox leaned closer. "I don't care. Just do it." Haven studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." Meanwhile, Celeste was already taking steps to protect herself and those around her. She had been in the public eye for years, but the threats that emerged in the wake of the investigation were more direct, more personal. An anonymous letter arrived at her office one morning, thinly veiled warnings against pushing the investigation further. A late-night call to her home phone, one that wasn't listed, came from a voice she didn't recognize, whispering her daughter's name before the line went dead. She knew she couldn't afford to brush these threats off. The stakes were too high, and the people relying on her, her family, the witnesses who had come forward, her team, needed to know she was in control. Celeste tightened her security, increasing patrols around her home and having her team screen every piece of mail and every incoming call. She contacted the FBI's Protective Services Division and assigned round-the-clock protection to her family. One night, as she sat in her home office reviewing the latest task force findings, her chief of staff called with another update. "Director," the voice on the other end said, "we've received intel suggesting someone's trying to track down the witnesses from Precinct 7's internal review. They've been digging into addresses, family members, financial records." Celeste's grip on her pen tightened. "Who? We don't have a name yet, but we know they're working through intermediaries. The witnesses are scared. A few have already called in, saying they're considering withdrawing their statements." Celeste exhaled slowly. "No, we can't let that happen. They've risked everything to speak out. We need to protect them." Her chief of staff hesitated. "How far should we go? This is stepping into dangerous territory." "Go as far as we need to," Celeste said firmly. "We'll double their security, relocate them if necessary. We'll make sure they know we have their backs." After the call, Celeste leaned back in her chair, Staring at the ceiling for a moment, she knew she was walking a fine line. One wrong move, one perceived overreach, and her opponents would pounce. They'd accuse her of abusing her position, of creating a spectacle. And that's exactly what Maddox and whoever he was working with were counting on. But she refused to let the pressure break her. Each threat, each setback only steeled her resolve. The intimidation tactics weren't just an attack on her. They were an attack on the integrity of the entire investigation. By trying to frighten witnesses into silence, Maddox's allies were revealing just how much they had to hide. Celeste poured her energy into building an airtight case. She worked long nights, combing through records, cross-referencing complaints, and reviewing footage. She held meeting after meeting with the task force, ensuring that every lead was followed, every piece of evidence preserved. She wasn't just looking for proof of Maddox's wrongdoing, she was uncovering the structures that allowed his behavior to persist, the policies that let misconduct fester. When news of the threats reached the Justice Department, additional federal resources were assigned to the investigation. The task force expanded, and Celeste found herself coordinating not just with her own team, but with cybercrime experts tracking digital threats, counterintelligence agents tracing the source of anonymous calls, and forensic analysts combing through decades-old records. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Maddox's actions were part of a larger pattern, one that couldn't be ignored. Despite the pressure, Celeste never let herself lose sight of why she had started this fight in the first place. It wasn't about proving Maddox wrong or retaliating against those who had targeted her. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was about changing a culture that had gone unchecked for far too long. And as the threats mounted, as the stakes rose, she became more determined than ever to see it through. It was late on a Wednesday evening when Celeste's chief of staff stepped into her office holding a thick, sealed envelope. "Director," he said quietly, "we have something. Something big." Celeste straightened in her chair, setting down the report she'd been reading. "What is it?" "We've had a whistleblower come forward from inside the precinct," he replied, closing the door behind him. "An officer who's been collecting documents for years. They've handed over everything. Emails, memos, video footage. It's damning." He placed the envelope on her desk, his face serious. Celeste opened it carefully, pulling out a stack of papers. The first page alone was a bombshell, an internal memo from a senior officer discussing how to reframe a use-of-force incident so it wouldn't attract public attention. The memo outlined step-by-step instructions for editing body camera footage, emphasizing what to leave out, and how to adjust timestamps to create acceptable ambiguities. As she flipped through the pages, the extent of the misconduct became painfully clear. There were emails between command staff, casually referring to citizens who had filed complaints as the usual agitators, and detailing how to delay investigations until complainants gave up. Another document described a pattern of intimidation. Officers allegedly visiting witnesses at home, making veiled threats, and suggesting that cooperating too much could have consequences. Most shocking were the video files. They were raw, unedited clips showing officers behaving in ways that were clearly outside the bounds of protocol. In one clip, an officer was heard laughing while recounting how they taught a lesson to a man they'd detained. Another video showed a group of officers discussing which parts of an incident to report and which to omit. It wasn't just isolated incidents. This was a culture, deeply ingrained and carefully protected. The documents and videos painted a picture of a department that had long prioritized protecting its own image over serving the community. Celeste's team worked through the night, reviewing every piece of evidence. By morning, the enormity of what they had uncovered was undeniable. The whistleblower, who remained anonymous for their safety, had given them a roadmap to systemic corruption. The implications stretched far beyond Maddox. "This changes everything," one of her investigators said as they reviewed the footage. "With this kind of evidence, we're not just talking about reform. We're talking about a complete overhaul." Celeste nodded, her expression grave. "This is the proof we've been missing. Now we have to use it." When news of the documents broke, the reaction was swift and fierce. Maddox's remaining allies, those who had publicly defended him, joined him in spreading counter-narratives, or remained silent as the truth emerged, began distancing themselves immediately. Statements of support were quietly deleted from social media. Former colleagues who had once praised Maddox now offered no comment. The tide had turned, and Maddox found himself increasingly isolated. The public, already skeptical of the department's credibility, was now fully outraged. The release of the documents and footage set off a national conversation about policing practices, transparency, and accountability. Civil rights leaders and community advocates who had long called for change used the evidence to demand sweeping reforms not only in Celeste's precinct, but across the country. One by one, key figures from Maddox's inner circle abandoned him. A former commander who had once vouched for him issued a public apology, saying, "I was wrong to defend him. I didn't know the full extent of his actions, and I can't stand by them." A local police union, under pressure from its members and the community, withdrew its support and called for an independent review of its own internal policies. The silence around Maddox grew louder and more telling. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs worked quickly to review the whistleblower's evidence. Within weeks, they issued a set of sweeping recommendations. The precinct was ordered to implement mandatory transparency measures, including public access to all use-of-force reports, routine audits by independent reviewers, and a ban on editing body camera footage without full disclosure. Senior officers implicated in the documents were placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Celeste watched as these changes were announced, but she remained clear-eyed. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. "We're just scratching the surface," she told her team during a meeting. "There are more departments out there with the same issues. More officers who think they're above the law. This is a step, but it's not the finish line." Her focus never wavered. As public sentiment solidified in her favor, she used that momentum to push for national reforms. She met with lawmakers to advocate for federal oversight of policing standards. She worked with community leaders to ensure that the changes taking place in her precinct were being replicated elsewhere. She called for the establishment of a permanent national database of officer misconduct, a resource that would make it nearly impossible for officers to escape accountability by simply transferring to another department. The calls for accountability grew louder, echoing from city councils to state legislatures to Congress. The documents from the whistleblower had done more than expose one precinct's corruption. They had revealed a pattern that many had suspected, but few could prove. Now, with evidence in hand, the conversation could no longer be ignored. As for Maddox, his attempts to build a counter-narrative crumbled under the weight of the whistleblower's revelations. The public knew the truth now, and no amount of spin could change it. His legal battles continued, but without support from his peers or the community, his case was no longer about clearing his name. It was about facing the consequences of his actions. In the weeks that followed, Celeste received messages from community members thanking her for her persistence. Parents who had once feared for their children's safety on the streets expressed cautious hope. Younger officers, inspired by the reforms, began approaching their jobs with a renewed sense of purpose. But Celeste knew there was still more work to be done. The culture she was fighting had been built over decades. Dismantling it would take time, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And while the whistleblower's documents had given her team a powerful tool, it was up to her to ensure that the momentum they had built didn't fade. "This is just the beginning," she said to herself one quiet evening, as she stood by her office window, looking out at the city below. "There's so much more to uncover, so much more to fix." The fight was far from over, but with the truth finally in the open, Celeste was more determined than ever to see it through. There's so much more to uncover, so much more to fix. The fight was far from over, but with the truth finally in the open, Celeste was more determined than ever to see it through. The lecture hall at Quantico was packed. Rows of new recruits, each one dressed sharply in their academy-issued uniforms, sat at attention as Celeste walked to the front of the room. The walls were adorned with photographs of past graduating classes and framed commendations for the Academy's history of excellence. But today wasn't about tradition. It was about transformation. Celeste adjusted the microphone and scanned the room, taking a moment to let the quiet settle. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I won't stand here and tell you that the job you've chosen is easy. It's not. Being an agent, serving your country, is one of the most difficult paths you can walk. But it's also one of the most important." Her gaze moved across the room, meeting the eyes of the young men and women who had chosen to follow in her footsteps. "The events of the past year have shown us that the badge you wear, the oath you take, and the trust placed in you by the American people are not guarantees. They must be earned every single day." The recruits listened intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and determination. Celeste continued, outlining the purpose of the new ethics and community engagement program. The curriculum went beyond policy manuals and legal codes. It included real-world scenarios, ethical dilemmas, and case studies of past failures. It was designed to instill not just knowledge, but a mindset, one that prioritized accountability, transparency, and empathy. "We'll teach you the law," she said. "We'll teach you investigative techniques, counterintelligence strategies, and how to handle high-pressure situations. But most importantly, we'll teach you how to lead with integrity, because if you fail to uphold the values this badge represents, you fail the people you've sworn to protect." The room was silent as her words sank in. These recruits weren't just hearing another lecture. They were being challenged to think about the kind of agents they wanted to become. Celeste knew that if she could instill that sense of responsibility now, they would carry it with them throughout their careers. But the work didn't stop at Quantico. Over the next several months, Celeste traveled to cities across the country, speaking to law enforcement officers, community leaders, and policymakers. At each stop, she shared her vision for a new era of policing and federal law enforcement. She talked about the importance of building bridges between agencies and the communities they served. She highlighted the successes of the pilot program, pointing to how transparency and accountability had begun to repair trust in even the most fractured precincts. In Chicago, she spoke at a packed town hall meeting. A young officer approached her afterward, his voice shaking slightly as he said, "Director James, I never thought I'd hear someone in your position say the things you said tonight. I joined because I wanted to help people, but I've seen things that made me doubt this job. You've made me believe it's possible to do it right." In Atlanta, she visited a community center that had once been wary of law enforcement. Children and parents gathered to listen as Celeste explained how the new training programs were helping to reshape how officers approached their work. A local pastor stood up at the end and said, "For the first time in years, I feel like we're not just being heard, we're being seen." Celeste's message resonated. As she spoke, she saw the shift in attitudes. Young recruits approached her after speeches, asking how they could get involved in community outreach programs. Seasoned agents began mentoring new officers, ensuring that the lessons Celeste championed weren't just part of a training module, but became part of the everyday culture. In time, the Quantico program became the gold standard for ethical training in federal law enforcement. Other agencies adopted similar initiatives, and the ripple effects spread through police departments and federal offices alike. Celeste's efforts inspired not just a change in policy, but a change in mindset. Recruits no longer joined solely for the prestige of a badge or the authority it conferred. They joined because they wanted to be part of something bigger, something honorable. Celeste remained pragmatic. She knew that no single program could solve all of law enforcement's issues. Misconduct wouldn't vanish overnight, and there would always be challenges. But she also knew that the foundation she had laid through her actions, her reforms, and her relentless advocacy, was solid. And that foundation would support meaningful change long after she was no longer at the helm. One evening, after delivering a speech in New York City, Celeste sat in her hotel room, looking out over the city's bright lights. She thought about the long road she had traveled, from her arrest to the investigation that followed, to the reforms that now spanned the country. There was still work to be done, but for the first time, she felt the weight of progress, a sense that the tides were truly turning. Director James, a young journalist, had asked her after the speech that night, "Do you think you'll ever see a perfect system?" "No," she had replied without hesitation. "Perfection isn't the goal. The goal is a system that corrects itself, that holds itself accountable, that never stops trying to improve. The goal is a system that protects the people it serves, and I believe we're closer to that than we've ever been." Celeste's words echoed in her mind as she looked out at the city. She had built something that would outlast her, a framework for integrity and honor. And with that, she knew that her work, while never truly finished, had made a difference that would endure. The precinct's halls felt different now. The posters lining the walls celebrated accountability and service rather than vague mottos about strength. The new leadership team, led by a captain known for transparency and fairness, made it clear that every complaint, every report, would be reviewed thoroughly. Officers who once scoffed at oversight now sat attentively in training sessions on bias and de-escalation. Changes that had once seemed impossible were now routine. Outside, community events that had previously been marred by tension began to transform. Neighborhood cookouts, hosted by precinct officers, were no longer met with suspicion, but with smiles. Parents brought their children to meet the officers, not to warn them, but to show them that these men and women were there to help. Trust, broken for so long, was starting to rebuild. Slowly, but surely. Celeste followed these developments closely. Letters and emails poured into her office from across the country. Some came from parents who felt safer letting their teenagers walk home after school. Others were from officers themselves, new recruits who saw her as an inspiration, and veterans who admitted they'd once doubted change was possible. One letter came from a woman who simply wrote, "Thank you for showing my grandson that integrity matters." Celeste kept the letters neatly organized in a box on a shelf, not out of pride, but as a reminder of why she had started this fight in the first place. It was never about personal recognition. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to go through what she did. It was about creating a system where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. In her office, she placed the badge she wore on that fateful day inside a small glass case. It sat on the edge of her desk, not as a trophy, but as a solemn reminder. That badge symbolized the cost of silence, the price of looking the other way. Every time she glanced at it, she remembered how close the system had come to failing entirely, and how much effort it took to set it on a better course. One crisp autumn morning, Celeste stepped out of her home and began her walk through the neighborhood, the same walk she had taken that day when everything changed. This time, as she turned the corner, she saw two officers patrolling on foot. They recognized her immediately, offering respectful nods. She returned the nod, noticing the ease in their demeanor. There was no tension in the air, no underlying sense of mistrust. The streets felt lighter. As she continued her walk, she passed a small park where children played and neighbors gathered. A few people smiled and waved, and she smiled back. The sun rose higher in the sky, its light filtering through the trees. With every step, Celeste felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. It wasn't victory, not exactly. It was something more enduring. It was the knowledge that she had played a part in ensuring justice didn't just arrive that day, but that it stayed. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.